Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Before we start, I wonder, where are you right now? Maybe settling into bed seeking a moment of calm. We're here to explore a vital winter survival skill that has been lost to time. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm and comfortable. Because tonight we're going to talk about cold, the deep kind that changes everything. Imagine a mid-January night. You're at home reading or watching something when the lights flicker and go out. Darkness falls. The heater stops. Outside, the wind howls and the temperature is already 15 below zero and dropping. In the first hour, you light candles, add layers, wrap yourself in blankets, telling yourself it'll pass soon. But what if it doesn't? What if the cold slowly seeps in through the walls you trusted? By the second hour, you can see your breath indoors. By the fourth, every room feels exposed. The solid walls now seem thin, and your modern home, no longer a safe haven, feels unfamiliar and unable to protect you. This isn't just imagination. It happened to millions during the Texas freeze of 2021. Northeast blackouts and countless winter storms. Modern homes are designed for a world where power never fails. But what if we built differently? What if people once knew something we've forgotten? About walls that hold warmth, spaces that work with you, homes that shelter something deeper. Tonight, we'll travel back to the mountains and forests of medieval Scandinavia, where 30 below zero was simply winter. There, ordinary people built log homes with stone and moss that kept families warm through the longest nights, without electricity or oil. They weren't primitive. They were masters of survival and warmth, guardians of wisdom lost in our rush toward convenience. If you're enjoying this, please like the video and subscribe for more quiet journeys into history. And leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing we're connected, all seeking a little warmth and peace. Now dim the lights, adjust your blanket, and settle in. We're about to discover how medieval peasants in their log cabins didn't just survive winter, they thrived. Their wisdom may hold answers we need today. Let's begin. There's something you need to understand before we go any further. The reason your house gets cold so quickly when the power fails, it isn't because you made a mistake. It isn't because builders today are incompetent or careless. The truth is both simpler and stranger than that. After the Second World War, something shifted in how we thought about homes. The world was rebuilding. Millions of young families needed places to live, and they needed them quickly. There wasn't time for the slow, deliberate craft that had shaped houses for centuries. There wasn't time to wait for timber to season, for stone to be quarried and shaped for the patient work of hands and simple tools. So we found new ways. Faster ways. We built houses the way we built dreams in those hopeful years after the war, quickly, lightly reaching upward. And like dreams, they were beautiful in their way. Efficient, affordable, modern, but also, like dreams, they were fragile, dependent on things continuing exactly as they were. Dependent on the power staying on the gas, flowing the oil burning. Dependent on a world that never paused, never stumbled, never went dark. Nobody meant for this to happen. Nobody planned to create homes that would become cold boxes within hours of losing electricity. It was just priorities shifted. Speed mattered more than mass. Cost mattered more than thermal wisdom. And the knowledge that medieval times had given us the understanding that medieval life had refined through centuries of bitter winters that got packed away like an old photo album. Still there, technically, but forgotten, gathering dust in the attic of collective memory. Let me show you what I mean with a story. A true story from the mountains of Norway. In December of 1872, a surveyor was sent to document an old wooden church in a village called Borgund. The church had stood there since the year 1180, nearly 700 years at that point, built entirely of timber in the old way. The surveyor arrived during one of the coldest spells anyone could remember. Outside, the temperature had plunged to 31 degrees below zero. The wind came down from the peaks like the breath of something ancient and merciless. He expected to find the church interior frozen solid, of course. Stone churches in that kind of cold became tombs of ice, their massive walls taking weeks to warm even with fires burning constantly. But when he stepped inside this wooden church, something impossible happened. It was comfortable. Not warm exactly, but not the killing cold either. The thermometer in his kit read 46 degrees Fahrenheit. 46 degrees. Inside a building that hadn't seen a fire in weeks, hadn't been heated at all, standing unoccupied in weather that could kill an exposed person in minutes. The surveyor wrote in his report that he couldn't understand it. The building violated everything he thought he knew about heat and cold, about winter and shelter. It was as if the wooden walls themselves remembered warmth from some earlier time and were still slowly, gently giving it back. Now you might think this was just one unusual building, an architectural accident. But here's what makes this matter, what makes this story more than just a curiosity from old Norway. Buildings like this existed all over medieval Scandinavia. Not just churches, but ordinary cabins, farmhouses, homes where medieval peasants lived through winters that made our modern cold snaps look gentle by comparison. Buildings that kept families alive and relatively comfortable through months of darkness and temperatures that regularly dropped to 40, below 50, below sometimes even colder. And these families didn't huddle in misery, burning through mountains of firewood, barely surviving until spring. That's the Hollywood version, the one we've been sold about medieval life. The reality was different. These people worked, told stories, raised children, carved intricate decorations into their walls, created beauty. They did this because their homes weren't draining their energy just to stay alive. Their homes were working with them, holding them, remembering warmth and giving it back through the longest nights. Fast forward to 2010. Researchers at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology wanted to understand this ancient winter survival skill, this forgotten wisdom about winter survival. So they built two identical small houses side by side in the mountains. One was constructed the old way, with thick, solid logs fitted together in the medieval times fashion. The other was built to modern standards, with modern materials insulated to current building codes, everything done properly according to contemporary understanding. Then they heated both houses to a comfortable temperature. And then they turned off the heat, completely, and they waited. The modern house, despite its higher R value, despite all its fiberglass insulation and vapor barriers and engineered materials, became uninhabitable in 9 hours. 9 hours. After that, the interior temperature had dropped below freezing. After 24 hours, it was a death trap, the kind of cold that would kill you in your sleep. The medieval cabin. After 72 hours, 3 full days with no heat at all, The interior was still 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, yes. You'd want extra blankets, certainly. But survivable, livable. A space where you could wait out the winter storm, the power outage, the crisis, whatever it was. A space that held onto warmth, the way good earth holds water, slowly, steadily refusing to let it go. So, what did those medieval times builders know that we've forgotten? What were they doing that we're not? That's the question that's going to carry us through tonight. That's the mystery we're going to unfold slowly, carefully, the way you might unfold an old map drawn in a language you're only beginning to remember. It comes down to three things. Three principles so simple they sound almost obvious once you hear them. But obvious isn't the same as easy, and simple isn't the same as simple-minded. These three principles worked out over centuries of trial and error by people who couldn't afford to get it wrong, are the difference between a house that dies when the power does and a house that keeps breathing, keeps living, keeps holding you safe, even when everything else fails. The first principle is thermal mass. Not insulation, but mass. Weight. Substance. Walls thick enough to remember. The second principle is absolute air tightness, achieved through understanding, not fighting, how wood moves and breathes. The third principle is radiant heat storage heat that soaks into stone and earth and timber, then slowly, faithfully returns through the cold hours. These aren't complicated technologies. Medieval peasants figured them out with hand tools and patient observation. But somewhere along the way in our rush toward the new and the fast and the cheap, we left them behind. And now, as our power grids become less stable, as our energy costs climb higher, as winter storms become more unpredictable, we're starting to understand what we lost. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the technical details, before we talk about physics and BTUs and thermal dynamics, we need to actually be there. We need to see what it was like, feel what it was like to live in one of these remarkable structures. We need to step into the space itself and let it teach us what it knows. So let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a power outage in winter? Even a short one? If you have, drop a comment and tell me, how long did your house stay warm? An hour, 4 hours? When did you start to feel that creeping cold? I'd genuinely love to know. Because understanding what we're missing starts with understanding what we have now. Close your eyes for a moment. Actually, you probably already have them half closed, which is perfect. Keep them that way. I want you to imagine something with me. You're standing at the edge of a clearing in a forest of pine and fir. The trees around you are ancient, their trunks wide as wagon wheels, their branches heavy with snow that fell sometime in the night. The air is so cold, it hurts to breathe each inhalation, a small sharp pain in your chest. Your breath comes out in clouds so thick you could almost grab them. And in the center of this clearing there's a cabin. It sits low against the earth, almost growing out of it, like something that was always meant to be there. The walls are made of horizontal logs, each one as thick as your torso, fitted together with such precision that you can't see where one ends and the next begins. The spaces between them are chinked with something that looks almost like living moss, still slightly green even in the depth of winter. The roof slopes steeply, shedding snow naturally, and there's a small curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. But here's what you notice most. The cabin isn't just sitting on the ground, It's been lifted up, raised on a foundation of carefully stacked stone that lifts the wooden floor a foot or more above the frozen earth. This isn't decoration. This is purpose. This is understanding that cold rises from the ground like water rises from a spring. And if you want to stay warm, you don't fight the cold. You simply lift yourself above it. The cabin doesn't look like a fortress. It doesn't look like something built to withstand a siege. If anything, it looks gentle, modest, almost humble. But there's something about the way it sits there in the winter landscape that makes you understand. This structure knows things. It has learned things across the centuries of standing against cold that would kill an unprepared person in an hour. This cabin isn't just a house. It's not just shelter in the simple sense of having a roof over your head and walls around you. It's something older than that, something deeper. If you watch it long enough, if you pay attention, you start to realize it's almost alive. Not alive like a person or an animal, but alive like a well-tended garden is alive like a forest is alive. It breathes with the seasons. It expands slightly in the summer warmth and contracts in winter's grip. The wood of its walls is still carrying sap, still responding to moisture in the air, still part of the natural world, even though it's been shaped by human hands into this form, this function. Think of it this way. The cabin is less like a house and more like a large, patient animal. A bear, perhaps. Something that understands winter in its bones, that knows how to move through the cold seasons, not by fighting them, but by working with them, by finding the rhythm of survival and settling into it completely. And the people who live inside, they're like the heart of this creature, small and warm and protected by layers of wisdom, turned into wood and stone. Inside, everything is designed around the central fact of winter. This isn't a summer home adapted for cold weather. This is a winter home that happens to work in summer too. Every choice, every measurement, every detail serves the single purpose of keeping human beings alive and comfortable when the world outside becomes actively hostile to human life. The main living space is surprisingly compact. Not tiny, but not sprawling either. Perhaps 20 feet on a side, maybe a bit less. The ceiling is low, just high enough that a tall man can stand upright, but no higher. This isn't about saving materials. This is about understanding that heat rises, and every extra inch of vertical space is heat you have to generate and maintain. Every cubic foot of air is air that needs warming. So you make the space human-sized, intimate, proportioned to actual life rather than to abstract ideas of grandeur. Against one wall, there's the heart of everything, a large masonry heater, what the people of medieval times called a kekaloon, built from soapstone or dense clay. It's not like a modern metal wood stove that gets hot quickly and cools quickly. This is patient. This is a structure designed to hold heat the way Earth holds water, slowly drinking it in, then slowly giving it back over many hours through the entire night if needed. A true winter survival skill passed down from medieval times. The windows are small, each one, a precious jewel of glass or oiled parchment. Not because glass was expensive, though it was, but because every window is a place where heat can escape, where cold can press in. So you make them small enough to let in light during the brief winter days, but no larger. You make them few. You place them where they'll catch what little winter sun there is. Everything is calculated, though the calculation isn't done with numbers on paper. It's done with experience, with memory, with the kind of knowledge that gets refined over generations of people living through winters that don't forgive mistakes. The floor is made of wide planks, fitted together with the same precision as the walls. Beneath it, that stone foundation we noticed earlier does its quiet work. The gap between the frozen earth and the floor acts as insulation, a buffer zone where the cold from the ground loses its strength before it can reach living space. In summer, this same gap keeps the floor from rotting, lets air circulate, prevents the moisture of earth from wicking up into the wood. It's elegant in its simplicity. It's the kind of solution that makes you wonder why we ever stopped doing it this way. Around the main space, there might be smaller rooms, a sleeping alcove perhaps, or a small storage area. These spaces are deliberately cooler than the main room. This is thermal zoning before anyone used that term. The heat concentrates where people are active, where they eat and work and tell stories. The sleeping areas can be cooler because that's what they're for. Sleeping under heavy blankets, bodies generating their own small warmth, which the cabin's walls will hold close through the night. Every surface inside is wood. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, even much of the furniture. This isn't decoration. This is function. Wood is warm to the touch in a way that stone or metal never is. Wood absorbs moisture from breath and cooking and releases it slowly, naturally regulating the humidity without any mechanical system. Wood, especially old-growth pine or spruce cut from trees that grew slowly in harsh conditions, has a certain quality. It's dense, heavy for its volume, full of resins and minerals pulled up from deep soil over decades, over a century even. This wood doesn't just sit there. It works. It participates in the life of the house. And perhaps strangest of all, perhaps most wonderful, the cabin smells alive. There's the scent of wood smoke, yes, but underneath that, something else. The faint, resinous smell of pine, even in logs that were cut generations ago. A hint of moss from the chinking, a note of stone from the heater. Smells that tell you this space is connected to the forest outside, to the earth below, to the natural world it was built from and continues to be part of. This cabin isn't trying to create an artificial environment completely separate from nature the way modern houses do. Instead, it's mediating the harsh realities of medieval life in extreme cold. It's not trying to establish an indoor climate that has nothing to do with the outdoor one. It's finding a middle ground between the deadly cold outside and the need for human warmth inside. It's a translator turning the language of winter into something humans can live with, can even thrive in. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This all sounds very romantic, very picturesque, very medieval documentary material, a quaint museum piece. But surely modern houses are better, more comfortable, more efficient. We've made progress, haven't we? Well, here's where things get interesting. Here's where we start to understand that maybe, just maybe, we've traded understanding for convenience. Maybe we've given up something essential in exchange for something that only works if everything else keeps working too. The cabin I've been describing to you, this structure, built with hand tools by medieval peasants living in harsh conditions, this building from an era we often think of as backward and primitive. This cabin has three qualities that modern buildings struggle to achieve even with all our technology and engineering. First, it has mass. Real, substantial thermal mass. Walls that weigh tons. Walls that act like batteries for heat, charging up slowly during the day and releasing that heat slowly through the night. This is the first chapter of our story tonight, the work of sleep, we might call it. Because thermal mass does its most important work while you're sleeping, keeping you warm through the darkest hours without any fire burning, without any energy input at all. Second, it has air tightness achieved through understanding wood rather than fighting it. The medieval times builders knew something we often forget. Wood moves. It swells with moisture and shrinks with dryness. It expands slightly in warmth and contracts in cold. You can't seal it the way you seal plastic or metal. You have to work with its nature. And when you do, when you understand it deeply enough, you can create seals tighter than anything we achieve with modern vapor barriers and tape. This is our second chapter, the experience of night, we might call it. Because air tightness is what makes the difference between a room that feels comfortable and one that feels drafty, and cold between a night of rest and a night of shivering. Third, it has radiant heat storage. Not forced air that moves and escapes. Not baseboard heaters that warm air but nothing else. But deep, patient heat stored in stone and wood, radiating outward steadily for 12, 15, 18 hours after the fire has gone cold. This is our third chapter, the knowledge of morning perhaps. Because when you wake in a medieval cabin, the first thing you notice is that you're not waking to brutal cold. Something kept you warm through the night. Something was still working, still caring for you even while you slept. These three things working together created homes that modern buildings, for all their technology, struggle to match. And tonight, we're going to understand each one. Not just intellectually, but in a way you can feel. In a way that might change how you think about shelter, about warmth, about what a home actually is or could be. But we're going to do this slowly, gently, the way winter teaches, through patient observation, through long nights, through the accumulation of small understandings that eventually become wisdom. So adjust your blanket now. Make sure you're comfortable. Because we're about to step inside that cabin into the warmth out of the cutting wind. We're going to experience what medieval life felt like in the hours before sleep, when the fire was burning and the family was together and the walls themselves seemed to lean in close, holding everyone safe. Let's go inside now. The door is open. The warmth is waiting. It's evening now. The sun set hours ago, though, in deep winter. This far north sunset might have come as early as 3 in the afternoon. Outside, the temperature is dropping steadily. 20 below, 25 below, heading toward 30 below by midnight. The kind of cold that makes the trees crack like rifle shots. The kind of cold that turns your spit to ice before it hits the ground. But inside the cabin, a different story is unfolding. The fire in the great stone heater has been burning all afternoon. Not a roaring fire. That would be wasteful, and waste is something medieval survival skills couldn't afford. Instead, a steady, patient fire fed with split logs of dense pine heartwood. The flames have been dancing steadily for hours now, and all that time, all those hours, the massive stones of the heater have been drinking in heat, absorbing it, storing it in their very substance, the way a well drinks water from the earth. The father has just placed the last log on the fire for the night. It will burn for another hour or so, then slowly die down to coals, then to ash. But by then, its work will be done. The heat has been transferred. The storage is full. The children are settling down for sleep, burrowed into their alcove under piles of wool blankets and furs. The mother is banking the coals, a practiced gesture she's made thousands of times. And as the family prepares for the long night ahead, the cabin itself is preparing too, getting ready to do its work, the work of sleep, the work of keeping them alive through 12 hours of darkness and deadly cold. Here's what's happening though. No one in that medieval cabin could have explained it in these terms. Here's what modern science has finally figured out. Measured, quantified, proven with instruments and calculations, confirming what medieval times already knew in their bones. Those log walls, each timber 8 or 10 inches thick, cut from pine trees that grew for 80 or 100 years in harsh mountain conditions. Those walls have mass, real, substantial, measurable mass. Each log weighs hundreds of pounds. The entire wall structure weighs tons. And all that mass, all that wood has been slowly warming up all day long. From the fire, yes. But also from the winter sun streaming through those small windows during the brief hours of daylight. From the heat of bodies moving around the space. From cooking. From every source of warmth in the cabin, no matter how small. The walls have been quietly, patiently drinking it all in. Think of it this way. Imagine the walls are like a vast sponge, but instead of absorbing water, they're absorbing heat. All day long, they've been soaking it up. The outer surface of the logs, the inner surface, and most importantly, the deep wood in the center of each timber. It's all been gradually warming. Not hot to the touch, not even particularly warm to the touch, but warmer than it was, warmer than the deadly air outside, warmer than the frozen earth below. And now, as the fire dies down, as the night deepens, as the temperature outside plunges to levels that would kill an exposed person in 20 minutes, those walls begin their real work. They begin giving back what they stored. Not all at once, not in a rush, but slowly, steadily, molecule by molecule, the heat that's soaked into the wood during the day radiates back into the living space through the night. This is thermal mass. This is the battery that doesn't need charging stations or lithium or rare earth minerals. This is the storage medium that humans figured out thousands of years before we figured out electricity. And it works. By God, it works better than almost anything we've invented since. A modern study, one of those experiments I mentioned earlier, measured this precisely. Researchers at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology put temperature sensors throughout a traditional log cabin and throughout a modern insulated house. Then they heated both to 70 degrees Fahrenheit and cut all heat sources completely. In the modern house, the temperature dropped catastrophically. After 6 hours, 68 degrees. After 9 hours, below 50. After 24 hours, below freezing. The house hemorrhaged its heat into the winter night. All that insulation, all that R value couldn't stop it. Because insulation only slows heat loss. It doesn't store heat. It can't give anything back because it never held anything to begin with. But in the log cabin, something different happened. After 6 hours, 69 degrees. After 12 hours, 65. After 24 hours, 58. After 48 hours, still above 50. After 72 hours, after 3 full days with no heat input whatsoever, the interior temperature was still 43 degrees. Survivable, livable with heavy blankets and warm clothes. Not comfortable perhaps, but not a death trap either. The researchers couldn't believe it at first. They thought their instruments were wrong. They ran the experiment again with more sensors, more precise measurements. The results were the same. The log walls were giving back the heat they'd stored, and they were giving it back so slowly that it took days for the interior to become truly dangerous. Now you might wonder, why? What's so special about thick wood? Why does this work? Part of it is simply the amount of material. Remember, each wall in that cabin weighs tons. Heat has to move through all that mass to escape, and heat moves slowly through wood. Wood is actually a pretty good insulator on its own, which means the heat trapped in the center of a thick log is trapped there for a long time before it can escape to the cold outside. But there's more to it than just thickness. The specific kind of wood matters tremendously. Those medieval times, builders weren't using just any timber. They were using old-growth wood trees that had grown slowly in harsh conditions. A tree that takes 80 years to grow big enough to use has wood that's fundamentally different from a tree grown in 30 years on a tree farm. Old-growth wood has tight growth rings, sometimes as many as 40 rings per inch. Modern, fast-grown lumber might have 5 rings per inch. Those tight rings mean the wood is denser, heavier for its volume. A cubic foot of old-growth pine might weigh 37 pounds. The same volume of modern pine might weigh 28 pounds. That difference matters. That extra weight is extra thermal mass, extra storage capacity for heat. There's also something called specific heat capacity. This is the amount of energy it takes to raise the temperature of a material by 1 degree. Wood has a relatively high specific heat capacity, meaning it takes a lot of heat to warm it up. But here's the beautiful part. It also takes a long time for it to cool down. It holds onto that heat stubbornly, reluctantly, giving it back in tiny increments spread over many hours. And there's one more factor, one that scientists are only recently beginning to understand fully. Wood is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs and releases moisture from the air. As moisture content changes, heat energy is absorbed or released through a process called latent heat of vaporization. When the air in the cabin gets drier, which it does as temperature falls, the wood releases a tiny bit of moisture. And when moisture evaporates, even in these tiny amounts, it requires energy. That energy comes from the wood itself, yes. But the effect is to slow down the cooling process even further. So when the last child is finally asleep, when the fire has burned down to glowing coals, when the parents themselves are settling in for the night, the cabin is just beginning its shift. From being a space that receives heat to being a space that gives it back. The walls themselves have become the heater. The walls themselves are doing the work of keeping this family alive through the night. Imagine it. It's 3 a.m. now, the darkest hour. Outside, the temperature has reached its lowest point, 32 below zero. The stars are so bright they look like chips of ice scattered across black velvet. The silence is absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree splitting in the cold. Inside the cabin, no fire burns, no flames dance. The heater is cold to the touch, or would be if anyone was awake to touch it. But the family sleeps comfortably under their blankets. The air temperature might have dropped to 60 degrees, maybe 55. Cool, yes. You'd want warm covers, but not dangerous, not even particularly uncomfortable, because the walls are still warm, not hot, not even really noticeable if you touched them. But warmer than the air, warmer than they have any right to be hours after the fire died. And from those walls, from every square inch of that massive wooden surface, heat radiates. Not visible heat like you'd see from a flame, Not convective heat, like from forced air, but radiant heat, infrared energy that warms bodies directly, that you feel as a gentle presence, as the opposite of that cutting cold outside. The father stirs briefly around 5 in the morning. He's been farming these mountains for 20 years. His body knows the rhythms. He wakes before dawn always. In summer, he wakes to birdsong. In winter, he wakes to silence and cold, but not deadly cold. Not even truly uncomfortable cold. He lies there for a moment, feeling the solid presence of the cabin around him. The walls haven't failed. The cold hasn't broken through. Another night survived. Another day earned. When the sun finally rises pale and weak, the interior temperature might be down to 50 degrees. Cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough to make you grateful for the fire he's about to build. But consider what's happened. 12 hours have passed since any fire burned in this space. 12 hours during which the temperature outside dropped 40 degrees below zero, and the temperature inside only fell 15 or 20 degrees from its evening warmth. The walls did that. The mass did that. The patient, faithful, silent work of thermal storage refined over centuries by medieval peasants who couldn't afford to get it wrong, who had no textbooks or engineering degrees, just observation and memory, and the accumulated wisdom of survival. A modern house, as we've seen, can't do this. Modern houses are designed around a completely different assumption. The assumption that heat will always be available on demand, that you'll always have electricity or gas, that the furnace will run whenever the thermostat calls for it. And under those conditions, the modern approach makes sense. Why build massive walls when you can build thin, cheap walls and just run the heater? But that assumption is fragile. Power grids fail. Natural gas pipelines freeze. Storms knock out electricity for days. And suddenly, all those thin walls, all that lightweight construction becomes a liability. The house that seemed perfectly adequate becomes a dangerous place. The temperature inside drops as fast as it would in a tent. Faster sometimes, because at least a tent doesn't have forced air ducts distributing cold air throughout every room. Medieval times didn't have that fragility. They built assuming the worst. Assuming long periods without fire. Assuming storms that lasted days. Assuming cold that didn't quit. And so, they built mass. They built storage. They built walls that worked for them instead of against them. There's something almost sacred about it when you think about it. Something almost devotional in the patience required. To cut a tree and let it season for years. To shape each log by hand, fitting it to its neighbors with such care that no gap remains. To stack these massive timbers one by one, knowing that you're not just building a house, but creating a kind of slow, patient machine for storing warmth. A machine with no moving parts, no technology, nothing that can break or wear out. Just wood and understanding and time. When the children wake, they wake to a cabin that held them through the night. The walls, if they could speak, might whisper what they've been doing. How they pulled in the warmth of yesterday's sun, yesterday's fire, yesterday's life, and held it close, held it safe, then gave it back through the dark hours degree by patient degree, asking nothing, expecting nothing, just doing what they were made to do. And this isn't just history. This isn't just a medieval documentary curiosity. Researchers in Austria and Switzerland are building modern mass timber structures right now using these same principles. They're finding that buildings with high thermal mass need 40% less energy to heat and cool than conventional structures. 40%. That's not a small improvement. That's transformative. The walls remember, that's the lesson here. That's what we forgot and are only now remembering. The walls can remember warmth can hold it, can give it back when it's needed most. Not through any complex technology, not through any special coating or treatment, just through being what they are. Massive, patient, faithful. As morning light fills the cabin, the father builds a new fire. Not because they're freezing, not because it's an emergency, but because it's time to begin again. Time to warm the space for the day's work. Time to start the slow, patient process of storing heat for the next night. The cycle continues. The walls drink in warmth. The walls give it back. Day after day, night after night, year after year, century after century. This is how medieval peasants stayed warm. Not by burning huge amounts of wood, not by huddling in misery, but by building homes that worked with them, that stored the work of the day and returned it through the night. By understanding thermal mass in their bones, even if they didn't have a name for it. And now, finally, we're beginning to understand it too. Beginning to remember what they knew. Beginning to build again the way they built, with patience and mass and respect for the simple physics of heat and cold wood and stone, day and night. The work of sleep is done. The family is awake. The cabin has done its job once again. And as the new fire begins to crackle and grow, you can almost feel the walls settling, preparing to store this new warmth too. Preparing for tonight's work for tomorrow's gift of remembered heat given back in the dark. Evening has settled in again. It's time for the main meal of the day. The time when the family gathers around the table, when the day's work is set aside for a few hours. Outside, the wind has picked up howling down from the mountain peaks with the sound of something hungry, something searching for a way in. You can hear it testing the walls, pressing against every surface, looking for weakness. But inside, the air is still. Not dead still, not suffocating. There's subtle movement as warm air near the heater rises and cooler air flows in to take its place, creating a gentle circulation. But there's no draft, no cold fingers of air reaching in from outside, no whistle of wind finding gaps in the walls. The candles on the table burn straight and steady their flames undisturbed. The father ladles stew from a pot that's been simmering near the heater all afternoon. Root vegetables, barley dried meat, all softened into something nourishing and warm. The mother cuts thick slices from a round loaf of dark bread. The children pass wooden bowls around. Spoons scrape gently against bowls. Someone laughs at something small. These are the sounds of a family of life, continuing of medieval life as it actually was when you strip away the Hollywood misconceptions. And all of this is possible. This comfort, this normalcy, this feeling of safety while a killing wind screams outside because of something remarkable. Something that medieval times builders understood perhaps better than we do today, even with all our advanced materials and computer modeling. The cabin is airtight. Not perfectly airtight, but close. Far closer than you'd expect from a building made entirely of logs, stacked horizontally. Far closer than most modern houses achieve, despite their vapor barriers and caulking and tape. This seems impossible, doesn't it? Wood shrinks and swells. Wood warps and twists. Wood moves with changes in temperature and humidity. How could you possibly create an airtight seal with a material that's constantly shifting, Modern building science tells us you need synthetic materials for that. Plastics and polymers and chemical adhesives. Yet these medieval cabins built with nothing but logs and simple natural materials achieved airtightness that modern energy auditors would envy. The secret lies not in fighting wood's nature, but in understanding it so deeply that you can work with it instead of against it. Let's start with the logs themselves. When medieval times builders selected timber for a cabin, they weren't just looking for straight trees. They were looking for matching trees. Trees from the same grove often. Trees that grew in similar conditions that would age and move in similar ways. Because when all your logs come from similar trees, they shrink together, settle together, move together. There's a harmony to it, a consistency. Each log was carefully examined. The builder would sight down its length, checking for twist, for excessive taper, for defects. And then came the most crucial step, the one that made everything else possible. A technique called scribe fitting, known in Norwegian as laas tømmer. Imagine the process. You've placed one log on the wall. Now you're ready to place the next log on top of it. But you don't just set it there and hope for the best. Instead, you take a tool, a kind of compass made of wood and metal. One point of this compass rides along the surface of the lower log tracing, every bump, every irregularity. The other point, held at a fixed distance, makes marks on the upper log, creating a perfect negative image of the log below. Then, using an adze and careful chisel work, you carve a groove along that marked line. This groove, called a score, follows the exact contour of the log below. When you finally set the upper log in place, it settles into perfect contact with the lower one. There are no gaps, no spaces where air could slip through. The fit is so precise that even centuries later, even after all the settling and shifting and seasonal movement, these joints remain remarkably tight. But the builders didn't stop there. They understood that wood moves most at its surface, where changes in humidity have the greatest effect. So they made the groove deeper than you might expect. Sometimes 3 inches deep, cut into logs that were already 8 or 10 inches thick. This created a sort of labyrinth for any air trying to pass through. Instead of just crossing a simple joint, the air would have to navigate this complex carved channel, losing pressure and velocity with every turn. And then came the chinking. This is where medieval times wisdom really shines. Modern builders use synthetic corks and foams, 1 part polyurethane, silicone, materials that remain flexible but don't breathe, don't move, don't adapt. They work until they don't. Until the sun breaks them down, or temperature cycling fatigues them, or they simply lose adhesion and peel away. Medieval builders used sphagnum moss, just moss, the kind that grows in bogs and wet forests throughout Scandinavia. But oh, what remarkable stuff this is. Sphagnum moss, when properly harvested and prepared, has properties that seem almost magical. It can absorb up to 20 times its dry weight in water. This means it swells dramatically when wet and shrinks when dry. And here's the beautiful part. It does this at the same rate, in the same rhythm as the wood around it. In summer, when humidity is high, both the moss and the wood swell together. In winter, when the air is dry, both shrink together. There's no differential movement. No separation, no gaps opening up. The moss and the wood breathe together, move together, live together. The moss has another property too. It's naturally antimicrobial. It contains compounds that inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi. This means it doesn't rot, doesn't break down, doesn't become a food source for insects or mold. Cabins have been found with moss chinking that's still functional after 400 years. 400 years. Try getting that kind of performance from a modern caulk. The technique for installing it was simple, but required patience. The moss would be harvested in late summer when it was dry and easy to handle. It would be twisted into loose ropes, sometimes mixed with small amounts of wool for additional resilience. Then these ropes would be pressed into the joints between logs, not packed tight enough to compress completely, but firm enough to fill the space. As the cabin settled over its first few years, as the logs dried and compressed under their own weight, the moss would be repacked as needed. Eventually, the whole structure would stabilize into a final form, with the moss creating an airtight seal that was also flexible, that could accommodate the seasonal movement of the wood without failing. Some builders added other materials to the mix. Clay mixed with horsehair or flax fibers, creating a primitive but effective adobe-like seal. Tar or pitch from pine trees boiled down and applied to the exterior surfaces. Every region had its variations, its local wisdom passed down through generations of experience. The result of all this careful work was remarkable. In those modern tests I mentioned, when researchers tested the airtightness of traditional log cabins, using blower door technology, they found air leakage rates that met or exceeded modern building codes. Some were tighter than newly constructed homes, proving once again that medieval documentary evidence of superior building techniques was not exaggeration. How is this possible? How can a building made of organic materials that move and breathe be tighter than one made with modern technology specifically designed to prevent air leakage? The answer, I think, is one of those lessons that keeps appearing in this story. The medieval builders weren't trying to dominate nature. They were trying to work with it. They accepted that wood moves, that organic materials change with seasons, and they designed around that reality rather than fighting it. Modern builders try to create a hard fixed barrier between inside and outside. When that barrier fails even slightly, the whole system fails. But medieval builders created flexible, adaptive systems. When the wood moved, the moss moved with it. When humidity changed, everything responded together. The system was alive in a way that modern systems aren't, and that aliveness made it more resilient, not less. Let's come back to that family at their dinner table for a moment. The father has finished eating. The mother is clearing away the bowls. The children are drowsy now, full of food and warmth. And through all of this, through the entire evening, not one person has shivered from a draught. Not once has cold air found its way in to disturb the warmth. The candle flames haven't flickered. This is what airtightness means in practical terms. This is the experience of it. Not as a number on a test report, not as a compliance with building codes, but as the simple fact of comfort. Of eating dinner without feeling cold fingers of air on the back of your neck. Of sleeping without blankets shifting because you're unconsciously trying to escape a draft you can't even identify. Modern houses, even expensive modern houses, often fail this basic test. You know the feeling probably. You're sitting in your living room and you feel a slight coolness. You adjust the thermostat. The furnace kicks on, but the coolness doesn't quite go away because it's not about temperature exactly. It's about air infiltration, small amounts of cold outside air finding its way in through gaps around windows, through holes where pipes penetrate walls, through 1,000 tiny imperfections in the building envelope. Building scientists have a measure for this. they talk about equivalent leakage area. The idea that all the little gaps in a house add up to something you can measure. In a typical modern American home, the equivalent leakage area is about equal to having a window open 2 feet by 2 feet. All the time. Every day. Every night. That's a lot of heat loss. That's a lot of cold air coming in. Your furnace isn't just heating your house. It's heating the outside air that's constantly infiltrating through all those invisible gaps. It's fighting a battle it can never quite win. Medieval cabins built without any modern materials or testing equipment achieved equivalent leakage areas, sometimes less than a third of that. Not because they had better technology, because they had better understanding. There's a Finnish study from 2003 that looked at traditional smoke cottages, the savupirti I mentioned earlier. These buildings, heated only by a large masonry stove with no chimney, relied absolutely on tight construction. Any significant air leakage, and the smoke wouldn't rise properly, would accumulate at floor level, would make the building uninhabitable. The study found that these cottages, some of them 300 years old, had maintained their air tightness through centuries of use. The combination of log construction, careful chinking, and the self-sealing nature of the materials as they aged had created buildings that would meet passive house standards if they were built today. Think about what this means. Think about the implications. Medieval peasants working with hand tools and local materials, with no formal education in physics or engineering, created buildings that match or exceed the performance of modern high-performance construction. Not sometimes, regularly, consistently. These weren't exceptional buildings. They were normal. This was just how you built if you lived somewhere cold and wanted to survive. And we've lost this. We've traded it for speed and cheapness, and the assumption that energy would always be abundant and cheap. We've created a built environment that requires constant energy input just to remain habitable. We've made ourselves dependent on systems that fail on supply chains, that break on an infrastructure that becomes more fragile every year. But we're starting to remember. Architects in Austria and Germany are reviving mass timber construction, using modern tools to achieve the precision that medieval builders achieved by hand. They're finding that these buildings don't just perform better thermally, they're healthier to live in. The wood regulates humidity, naturally keeping interior moisture levels in the comfortable range without mechanical humidification or dehumidification. The absence of synthetic materials means lower levels of volatile organic compounds, better indoor air quality, fewer respiratory problems. There's even research suggesting that living in wood buildings reduces stress. The Japanese have a word for this: Shinrin-yoku forest bathing. The idea that exposure to wood, even processed wood, has measurable physiological benefits. Lower blood pressure, reduced cortisol levels, better sleep. As if something in our primate brains still remembers, the trees still relaxes when surrounded by wood instead of plastic and drywall. In that cabin, as the family finishes their evening meal, as the father begins to prepare the fire for overnight, as the children drift towards sleep, they're experiencing something we've mostly lost. They're experiencing what it feels like to be truly sheltered. Not just under a roof, not just surrounded by walls, but held, protected, cradled in a structure that understands in its very materials and construction what human beings need to feel safe. The wind keeps howling outside. It will howl all night. Tomorrow there might be another foot of snow on the ground. The temperature might drop even further, but inside the air will remain still. The warmth will hold. No draught will disturb their sleep. Because of logs fitted by hand, because of moss harvested from bogs, because of patience and understanding and skills refined across generations until they became almost instinctive, almost unconscious, just the way things were done. This is the second pillar. This is the second piece of the puzzle. Mass gives you storage. Airtightness gives you retention. Together, they create something greater than the sum of their parts. They create a building that doesn't just resist the cold, but actively maintains warmth, that doesn't leak heat as fast as you can generate it, but holds it close, guards, it releases it only slowly and reluctantly. And there's one more piece to this, one more chapter to understand. Because mass and air tightness are crucial, yes, but they're not quite enough. There's still the question of how you generate that heat in the first place, and more importantly, how you distribute it efficiently, how you use it wisely, how you make the most of limited fuel in a place where wood, though abundant, still represents hours of hard labor to cut and haul and split. That's where we're going next, to the heart of the heating system, to the masonry heater that makes everything else possible, to the understanding of radiant heat versus convective heat, of stored warmth versus immediate warmth, of patient fire versus desperate fire. But for now, for this moment, just imagine sitting at that table, full of warm food, surrounded by family, the wind trying its best to get in, and failing, always failing, held back by walls that understand their job, by seals that work by construction that has proven itself across centuries. This is what it means to be warm. Not just warm in temperature, but warm in the deeper sense. Safe, held, protected. This is what medieval life achieved, what medieval times builders created, what we're only now learning to appreciate again. The candles burn steady. The air is still. Outside, the cold presses close. Inside, life continues comfortable and secure. Dawn comes slowly this far north in winter. First, just a faint lessening of the absolute dark. Then a pale grey light that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The stars fade one by one. The sky shifts from black to deep blue to a cold, clear silver. Inside the cabin, someone stirs. The father, most likely. He's always the first awake, has been for 20 years of farming these mountains. His body knows the rhythms, knows when darkness is about to yield to light, when it's time to begin the day's work. He slips out from under the heavy blankets. The air is cool on his face, perhaps 50 degrees. Cool enough to wake you up fully, but not uncomfortable. Not the shocking, breath-stealing cold you'd feel in a modern house after the furnace has been off all night. Something is still working. Something is still keeping this space livable. He crosses to the masonry heater in the dim pre-dawn light. The fire died hours ago. The last flames probably faded around midnight, the coals glowing for perhaps another hour after that. Then darkness. The heater has been cold, or should have been cold, for 6 hours or more. He places his palm against the smooth soapstone surface. It's warm, not hot. You're not going to burn yourself, but definitely unmistakably warm, like touching a sun-warmed rock on a summer afternoon. That kind of gentle, patient warmth that seems to radiate from deep within the stone itself. This is the third pillar. This is the final piece of the puzzle that let medieval times survive winters that would kill modern people used to climate-controlled comfort. This is heat storage raised to an art form refined across centuries, until it became one of the most efficient heating systems humans have ever developed. The masonry heater has many names across Northern Europe. In Scandinavia, it might be called a kakelun. In Finland, a varava tulisija. In Germany, a kachelofen. In Russia, a masonry stove or pech. The names vary, but the principle is the same. Instead of burning a small amount of fuel continuously, the way a modern wood stove does, you burn a large amount intensely for a short time. The heat from that intense fire is captured in a massive structure of stone or brick or clay, and then for the next 12 to 18 hours that stored heat radiates gently back into the living space. Let's understand how this works, because it's brilliant in its simplicity and remarkably sophisticated in its effect. The heater itself is a large structure, maybe 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, built from dense materials. Soapstone is ideal because it has exceptional heat storage capacity, but fired clay or dense sandstone works too. The key is mass, lots of it. The entire structure might weigh 2 tons, 3 tons, sometimes more. Inside this massive structure, there's a firebox, but it's not like a modern wood stove firebox. It's larger, designed to hold a substantial load of wood. And more importantly, there's a complex system of channels and baffles that force the hot gases from the fire to take a long, winding path before they exit through the chimney. When you light the fire, you don't feed it continuously. Instead, you load the firebox completely with split wood, light it, and let it burn hot and fast. Very hot. The temperature inside can reach 800 degrees Fahrenheit or more. This intense heat ensures complete combustion. The wood doesn't smolder, it doesn't smoke. It burns completely and cleanly, turning almost entirely into heat and a small amount of ash. But here's where the magic happens. Those hot gases, instead of going straight up the chimney, are forced to travel through the internal maze of channels. As they move through these channels, they transfer their heat to the massive stones surrounding them. The gases cool as they go, giving up more and more of their thermal energy. By the time they reach the chimney, they've given up most of their heat. They're still warm enough to create a draft, but they're not carrying away all your heat the way a straight chimney would. The stones, meanwhile, are drinking in this heat. All that thermal energy is being absorbed into their mass. The surface of the heater gets warm, then hot. But the real storage is happening deep in the stone in the interior of those massive walls. Heat is conducting inward, saturating the entire structure with thermal energy. This burn might last 2 hours, maybe 3 if you really loaded it up. Then it's done. The fire burns down. The firebox goes cold. You close the damper to prevent any remaining heat from escaping up the chimney. And now, the heater begins its real work. For the next 12 hours, 15 hours, sometimes 18 hours, that mass of stone slowly gives back what it absorbed. Not all at once, not quickly, but steadily, patiently, the way a good friend keeps a promise. The surface stays warm to the touch. Stand near it, and you feel the heat radiating outward. This is radiant heat infrared energy that warms objects and people directly, rather than heating air. This is crucial. This is one of the key differences between this system and modern forced air heating. Forced air heats the air in the room. That air rises to the ceiling where it's wasted. It creates drafts as it circulates. It dries out mucous membranes. It distributes dust and allergens. And it requires constant energy input because air doesn't store heat well. As soon as the furnace stops, the air starts cooling rapidly. Radiant heat is different. It works like sunlight. When you stand in winter sunshine, the air around you might be freezing, but you feel warm because the infrared radiation from the sun is warming your body directly. The masonry heater creates the same effect indoors. You can have relatively cool air temperature, 55 or 60 degrees, but feel perfectly comfortable because you're being warmed by radiation from the heater's mass. Medieval life revolved around this understanding. The heater was typically located in the center of the living space or incorporated into a wall separating the living area from a sleeping alcove. This positioning meant radiant heat could reach all parts of the small cabin. At night, sleeping close to that warm mass was like sleeping next to a banked fire, except safer, cleaner, requiring no tending or monitoring. The efficiency of this system is remarkable by any standard. Modern testing has shown that well-designed masonry heaters can convert 80 to 90% of the wood's energy into usable heat. Compare this to an open fireplace, which might achieve 15% efficiency. Compare it even to a modern metal wood stove, which typically reaches 60 to 70%. The masonry heater wins decisively. And there's another advantage that's harder to quantify, but just as important. Burning wood intensely and completely, the way these heaters do, produces far less smoke and particulate matter than burning wood slowly in a modern stove. Those medieval villages, contrary to the popular image, weren't constantly shrouded in smoke. The combination of efficient combustion and the heater's filtration through the stone channels meant relatively clean exhaust. A Norwegian study from 2010 measured emissions from traditional masonry heaters compared to modern wood stoves. They found that the masonry heaters, when properly operated, produced less fine particulate matter and lower carbon monoxide levels. The intense complete combustion was cleaner than the smouldering incomplete combustion typical of modern stoves. There's poetry in this, don't you think? The idea that ancient technology developed through trial and error by people with no scientific training ends up being cleaner and more efficient than modern alternatives. It makes you wonder what else we've lost in our rush toward the new, what other wisdom we've set aside as primitive when it was actually sophisticated in ways we failed to recognize. In that cabin, as dawn light begins to filter through the small windows, the father might add a few sticks of kindling to the firebox. Not because the heater has gone cold. It hasn't. But because he's going to start the day's big burn soon, and it's easier to start a fire from embers than from cold stone. The morning fire, the big burn, will heat the stones for the coming night. The cycle continues day after day, and rhythm as reliable as breathing. Think about what this means for fuel consumption. A modern house in a cold climate might burn through a cord of wood every week or two if heated primarily with wood. That's a lot of cutting, a lot of hauling, a lot of splitting. It's basically a part-time job just to keep warm. The medieval cabin with its masonry heater might use a quarter of that, maybe less. One substantial burn per day using perhaps 30 or 40 pounds of wood. Over a week, that's 200 to 300 pounds. Over a winter, maybe 3 or 4 cords total. This isn't just a minor improvement. This is the difference between survival being marginally possible and survival being relatively comfortable. And remember, every piece of wood used represented labor. Trees had to be felled usually in late summer when the sap was down. They had to be limbed and bucked, hauled to the homestead sometimes over considerable distance. split and stacked to season. This wasn't just firewood. This was stored labor-stored, time-stored sweat. Using it efficiently wasn't just practical, it was respectful. It honored the work that went into it. There's a phrase in Finnish that captures this kunnioita tulta, respect the fire. This doesn't just mean be careful with fire, though that too. It means understand what fire is, what it costs, what it gives. Use it wisely. Waste nothing. The masonry heater is the physical embodiment of that respect. It wastes nothing. It uses every BTU of heat that combustion produces, capturing it, storing it, releasing it, when and where it's needed. Modern humans have lost this mostly. We flip a switch or turn a dial. Heat appears. We don't think about where it comes from or what it costs, not really. The bill arrives at the end of the month and we pay it, but there's no physical connection to the energy we're using. We've abstracted it into numbers on paper, electricity flowing through wires, gas burning in a furnace we never see and barely think about. Medieval life couldn't do that. Energy was visible, concrete. The woodpile outside the door was your fuel gauge. You could see exactly how much you had left, could measure it against the length of winter still to come. This created a different relationship with heat, with warmth, with survival. More conscious, more careful, not anxious necessarily if you'd prepared well, but aware, always aware. And the masonry heater was the centerpiece of that awareness. It was the tool that made awareness translate into comfort. Because being conscious of your limited resources doesn't do much good if you're still shivering. But when you have a system that uses those resources with remarkable efficiency, suddenly consciousness becomes empowerment. You know you have enough. You know the math works. You can relax into the winter, into the long nights, into the cold, because you've built the technology that makes survival not just possible, but sustainable. Researchers in Austria and Germany are rediscovering this now. The passive house movement, which focuses on buildings that need minimal energy input, has found that incorporating thermal mass, especially in the form of modern masonry heaters, dramatically reduces energy consumption. A passive house with a masonry heater might need only 1/10 the heating energy of a conventional house. 1/10. That's not incremental improvement. That's revolutionary reduction. And the comfort level, the subjective experience of living in such a space, is reportedly superior to living in a conventionally heated home. The steady, gentle, radiant heat. The stable temperatures without the ups and downs of forced air cycling on and off. The absence of dry air and circulating dust. People report sleeping better, having fewer respiratory issues, just feeling more comfortable overall. We're reinventing what medieval times already knew. We're discovering through careful measurement and scientific analysis what they understood through observation and experience. The best heating system isn't the most high-tech or the most convenient. It's the one that works with physics rather than against it. The one that stores energy when you have it and releases it when you need it. The one that respects fuel efficiency and human comfort in equal measure. Back in that cabin, the father has finished his preparations. The day's big fire is laid. He'll light it after breakfast, feed it for 2 hours, then let it die while the stones store the heat. Tonight, as the family gathers for the evening meal, those stones will still be warm. Through the night, as they sleep, the warmth will continue. Tomorrow morning, he'll wake to find the heater still holding heat, still doing its work, still keeping them safe. This is the knowledge of morning. This is what greets you when you wake in a space heated this way. Not cold, not desperate, not immediately needing to fire up the furnace before you can even think about starting the day, but comfortable, held, cared for by a system that works while you sleep, that asks nothing of you in the dark hours, that just continues its patient service day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The light is stronger now. The sun hasn't risen yet, but it's coming. The cabin is waking up. The children will be stirring soon. The mother will start preparing breakfast. Life continues in this tiny wooden structure in the middle of winter wilderness, comfortable and secure, because three principles work together in harmony. Mass stores the heat, air tightness retains it, radiant distribution delivers it where it's needed when it's needed with minimal waste. These aren't just technical specifications. These are the physics of survival. These are the principles that let humans thrive in places that would otherwise kill them. And every one of these principles is something we can use today, something we can learn from, something we can incorporate into how we build and how we live. The masonry heater in the corner isn't just a heat source. It's a teacher. It's a demonstration that doing things the slow way, the patient way, the way that requires understanding materials and respecting their properties, often gives you better results than the fast, convenient, thoughtless way. The warmth you feel from that stone isn't just physical heat. It's the warmth of accumulated wisdom. It's the warmth of solutions that work because they're built on deep understanding rather than shallow assumptions. It's the warmth of human ingenuity applied not to dominating nature, but to working with it, finding the elegant solution that nature herself would approve of if nature could approve. And as the sun finally breaks the horizon, as true daylight fills the cabin for the first time in 16 hours, that heater continues its work. Warm to the touch, patient, faithful. A friend that never sleeps, never forgets, never fails to give back what you gave. It measured out in perfect proportion to your need. This is how medieval times survived. This is how they turned winter from a season of desperation into a season of life, different from summer certainly, but livable, manageable, even in its way, beautiful. There are secrets that don't live in books. They live instead in the tight growth rings of 100-year-old pines, in the way moss keeps its grip on a stone foundation through centuries of freeze and thaw, in the patient knowledge of how to lift a building just high enough above the frozen ground that cold cannot climb up through the floor, but snow can still drift protectively around the base. These are the quieter technologies of medieval times. The supporting cast, you might call them, to the three main principles we've explored. But supporting doesn't mean unimportant. These additional elements were crucial to the overall system. And like everything else in these remarkable buildings, each represents a solution, elegant in its simplicity, sophisticated in its understanding. Let's start with something that seems trivial at first glance: the size and layout of rooms. The medieval cabin we've been exploring isn't large. Maybe 400 square feet total living space, perhaps less. The main room is compact. The ceiling is low. Modern people might call it cramped, claustrophobic even. But this isn't accidental. This isn't about saving materials, or because medieval peasants didn't know how to build larger structures. They built massive churches and great halls when needed. They understood scale. The compact size serves a crucial function. Remember that every cubic foot of air is air that needs to be heated. Double the size of a room, and you've doubled the volume of air, doubled the amount of heat required to maintain comfortable temperature. In a climate where heating was the primary concern, 6 months of the year, this mattered enormously. The low ceiling worked the same way. Heat rises. If your ceiling is 12 feet high, all that warm air accumulates uselessly overhead. But with a ceiling at 7 feet, just barely high enough for a tall person to stand comfortably, the heat stays where people actually live. Where they sit, where they sleep, where they work with their hands. This is thermal zoning before anyone invented the term. The sleeping alcoves were often slightly separated from the main living space, sometimes by a heavy curtain, sometimes by a partial wall. These alcoves could be cooler. When you're under wool blankets and furs, you don't need the same air temperature as when you're active. So let those spaces be 50 degrees, 45 degrees even. Concentrate the heat where it's needed. Use every BTU efficiently. The Japanese have a similar concept with their kotatsu, a heated table under which people gather, keeping their bodies warm while letting the room temperature drop. Different implementations, same principle. Recognize that you don't need to heat cubic feet of empty air. You need to heat bodies, the spaces immediately around bodies. Everything else is waste. Modern houses have lost this wisdom entirely. We heat every room to the same temperature whether anyone's in them or not. We heat hallways, bathrooms, guest rooms that see use twice a year. We create climate-controlled environments where the temperature is identical from floor to ceiling, from inhabited space to storage space. It's profligate, it's wasteful, and it's only possible because we've had cheap energy. That era is ending. Maybe it's already ended. And suddenly the medieval approach starts looking less primitive and more prophetic. Let's talk about the foundation again, because there's more to understand there. That small gap between the floor and the earth matters more than it seems. By lifting the cabin onto stone, medieval builders did several things at once. They kept moisture from creeping up into the wood. They allowed air to move freely beneath the structure. And most importantly, they broke the bond between warmth and the frozen ground. Even frozen soil pulls heat away. A house resting directly on it is always bleeding warmth downward. But raise the building, leave space for air, and that loss slows dramatically. Air resists the cold. The earth can no longer reach inside so easily. The same space works in summer, keeping dampness from rising and turning the interior heavy and stale. It is a simple idea, quietly effective all year long. Stone placed with care, a house resting not trapped. Medieval builders understood this instinctively, not as theory, but as lived experience. Warmth must be separated from the cold earth. They also understood movement. In places like Sweden, small buildings were set on loose stones that could shift when the ground froze and swelled. When the soil moved, the stones moved with it. Nothing cracked, nothing broke. When the thaw came, everything settled back into place, flexible, patient, enduring. The roof tells the same story. Medieval cabins rose into steep, sharp triangles, not for beauty, but for survival. Snow cannot linger on a steep roof. It slides away before weight builds, before ice dams form, before water finds a way inside. Rain runs off quickly. The structure stays dry, and dryness is the quiet secret behind longevity. Inside, the walls were left bare, solid wood breathing, absorbing moisture when the air was heavy, releasing it when the air grew dry. No machines, no controls, just material quietly doing its job. When we cover wood, we silence that ability and replace it with systems that demand energy and attention. Again and again, the same pattern appears. These buildings did not fight nature. They worked with it, not out of romance, but necessity. Energy was precious. Mistakes were costly. Wisdom came from watching what endured. Today, as energy grows expensive and systems grow fragile, this way of building no longer looks old-fashioned. It looks prepared. Modern research now confirms what medieval builders felt without numbers or equations. Wood stabilizes humidity. It calms the body. It creates spaces where people sleep better and feel more at ease. Buildings that regulate themselves. After the war, we chose speed over patience, cost over endurance. We assumed energy would always fill the gaps. For a time, that assumption worked. Now it feels less certain. The lesson is not to go backward. Medieval life was harsh, but their shelters were quietly brilliant. The future may belong to a blend of both worlds. Modern precision guided by old understanding. Technology that supports rather than replaces natural processes. That small wooden cabin is not just history. It is a reminder of what is possible when we listen to materials respect limits and build as if the world might someday go quiet again. There's something we haven't talked about yet. Something that might be the most important part of this entire story. These cabins, these remarkable structures that could hold warmth through the deadliest winter night. They didn't just keep bodies alive, they freed the human spirit. Think about what it means to not have to fight for survival every single day. Think about what becomes possible when your shelter actually works, when you can trust it, when you're not constantly cold or worried about running out of fuel, or desperately trying to stay warm. In those medieval Scandinavian communities, through those long winter months, when temperatures stayed below freezing for weeks on end, when snow lay 6 feet deep, when going outside was difficult and sometimes dangerous, the people weren't just surviving, they were living, creating, thinking, telling stories, carving intricate patterns into wood, making music, raising children, planning for spring, dreaming, because the house worked, because they weren't spending every waking moment just trying not to freeze. The efficiency of the structure, the wisdom of the building methods gave them something precious: time, energy, mental space. Let's imagine a winter evening in one of these cabins. The family we've been following, but now let's place them in their larger context. This cabin isn't isolated. It's part of a small farming community, maybe 20 families total scattered across a mountain valley. Each family in their own cabin built to the same principles, equally efficient, equally warm. In the depths of winter, when farm work is impossible, when the fields lie under snow and the livestock are sheltered in their own carefully built barns, the people have time. Long evening hours when work is done early and there's nothing to do but be together. So they tell stories. The old ones particularly, who remember other winters, other years. They tell about the year of the great snow, when drifts covered the doors and they had to tunnel out. About the trader who came from 3 valleys over with news and goods. About the time someone saw the northern lights dance green and purple across the entire sky. These aren't just entertainment. These are how knowledge gets passed down, how wisdom accumulates. The young people hear about mistakes made and lessons learned. They hear about successful strategies and failed experiments. They're being educated, but not in a formal way, just through the natural sharing of experience that happens when people have time together, when they're comfortable enough to talk, when the house holds them safe and warm while winter rages outside. The father might be carving while stories are told. Not rough work, but fine detail. Work on a chair or a tool handle, decorative patterns that serve no practical purpose except to be beautiful, to be satisfying to make and to see. This is art, really. This is humans doing what humans do when their basic needs are met and they have energy left over. They create. The mother might be spinning wool, the steady rhythm of the wheel filling the space between words, or working on embroidery, adding colour and pattern to cloth. Again, this isn't strictly necessary. Plain cloth would work fine. But it's what she wants to do, what brings her satisfaction. The efficiency of the house, the effectiveness of the heating system has given her the freedom to want things beyond mere survival. The children might be playing a game, not a video game or anything electronic, but something with stones or carved wooden pieces. Or they might be learning skills from their parents, watching and imitating, absorbing the knowledge they'll need as adults. All of this is possible because no one is desperately cold. No one is huddled in misery just trying to make it through another night. Compare this to what happens in a poorly built house, a structure that leaks heat, that requires constant attention to the fire, that never quite gets warm enough, where cold drafts find you no matter where you sit. In that environment, you don't have energy for art or storytelling or teaching children. You're just trying to survive, just trying to stay warm. Every bit of wood you burn is wood you'll need to cut and haul and split tomorrow. The anxiety never stops. The desperate calculus of resource management never allows you to relax. But in a well-built cabin with its thermal mass and air tightness and efficient radiant heating, there's abundance. Not material abundance necessarily. These were still medieval peasants after all, with limited possessions and hard lives by modern standards. But abundance of time, abundance of comfort, abundance of the mental and emotional space needed for human flourishing. This is why these communities produced such rich cultural traditions. The intricate wood carving called acanthus that decorated everything from butter molds to church portals. The elaborate knitting patterns that varied from valley to valley, each community with its own distinctive style. The folk music, the stories, the accumulated wisdom of generations living in harmony with a difficult land. None of this would have been possible if people were struggling just to survive winter. Culture requires surplus. Not surplus wealth necessarily, but surplus time, surplus energy, surplus comfort. The cabin provided that surplus by being so damn good at its job. There's archaeological evidence for this. When researchers study medieval Scandinavian settlements, they find signs of prosperity even in remote mountain communities. Evidence of trade, of craft specialization, of people having time to do things beyond basic subsistence. And the further north you go, the more critical the building techniques become. The communities that survived, that thrived, even were the ones with the best building traditions, the most efficient heating systems, the deepest understanding of how to create shelter that truly sheltered. The communities that failed, that were abandoned, often show evidence of poorer construction. Thinner walls, less attention to air tightness, less sophisticated heating. These physical differences translated directly into human outcomes. Some people made it, some people didn't. And the difference often was the house. This isn't romantic speculation. This is what the evidence shows. The quality of shelter was life and death, yes, but it was also the difference between merely surviving and actually living. Now, fast forward to today. We're seeing a revival of interest in these traditional building methods, particularly in parts of Europe that never completely lost the knowledge. In Austria, Switzerland, southern Germany, you can find new buildings being constructed with solid timber walls, with careful attention to thermal mass and air tightness, often incorporating modern versions of masonry heaters. These aren't museum pieces or nostalgic recreations. These are serious contemporary buildings, designed by architects with engineering degrees, built for people who want efficiency and comfort. And they're finding that the old principles still work. In fact, they work better than many modern alternatives. A study from 2018 looked at energy consumption in mass timber buildings versus conventional construction in Austria. The mass timber buildings used on average 40% less energy for heating and cooling. 40%. That's enormous. That's the difference between a high energy bill and a low one. Between a carbon footprint that matters and one that doesn't. Between being vulnerable to energy price fluctuations and being relatively insulated from them. But there's more to it than just numbers. The people living in these buildings report higher satisfaction, better comfort, a sense of living in a space that feels alive in some way. They talk about how the building feels stable, how temperature swings are minimal, how the air quality feels better. They're experiencing in modern form what medieval times experienced in those log cabins. And there's starting to be social science research on this too. Studies looking at how housing quality affects human well-being. And consistently, they find that buildings with good thermal mass, with stable temperatures, with natural materials, contribute to lower stress, better sleep, even better social interactions within families. It makes sense when you think about it. If you're comfortable in your home, if you're not constantly dealing with drafts or excessive heating costs or temperature swings, you have more energy for other people. You're less irritable, more patient, better able to be present for your family, your community. The medieval cabin did this by design, though the design wasn't conscious in a modern sense. It was evolutionary. The building methods that worked got passed down. The ones that didn't were forgotten. Over centuries, this created a design that was optimized not just for thermal efficiency, but for human life. The compact space brought people together. There was no retreating to separate rooms, no isolation. You were with your family always. This could be difficult, certainly. Privacy was limited, but it also meant connection was constant. Children learned from parents by observation. Elders were integrated into daily life, not set aside. The family was a unit because the house made it a unit. In modern homes, we've gone the opposite direction. Everyone gets their own room. We spread out. We can go all day without really seeing each other, even though we're all in the same building. We've prioritized individual space over communal connection. And then we wonder why people feel isolated, why families feel fragmented. I'm not saying we should go back to one-room cabins. That's not realistic or desirable for most people. But there's something to be learned from how those spaces brought people together, how they created environments where community happened naturally because the structure itself encouraged it. Some modern architects are exploring this. Designing homes with central gathering spaces that are warm and inviting, with good thermal mass and radiant heat, while bedrooms and private spaces are more minimal, less heated. It's a compromise, a way of getting some of the benefits of the traditional layout, while still having the privacy that modern life expects. And it's working. People who live in houses designed this way report spending more time in common spaces, more interaction with family, more of that quality togetherness that seems to be increasingly rare in modern life. The cabin didn't just keep people warm, it shaped how they lived, how they related to each other, how they spent their time. The physical structure created social structure. The efficiency of the heating system freed time and energy for culture, for craft, for all the things that make human life rich instead of just bearable. This is the third layer of wisdom here. First, the physical principles, mass, air tightness, radiant heat. Second, the practical benefits, efficiency, comfort, resilience. And third, the social consequences. Time for culture space, for community energy, for flourishing. All of this from wood and stone and moss. From careful observation and patient refinement. From people who didn't have PhDs or computers or any of the tools we consider essential today, but who understood something essential about how to create spaces where humans could thrive in harsh conditions. That family in their cabin on that winter evening, with the fire banked and the stories flowing and the walls holding them safe. They're not just surviving, they're living well. And the structure that makes this possible isn't a luxury. It's not an expensive addition or an optional upgrade. It's fundamental. It's the difference between winter being a season of endurance and winter being a season of life, different from other seasons certainly, but livable, even beautiful in its way. This is what we're trying to recover now, not the specific form of the medieval cabin, but the principle behind it. Building in a way that supports human flourishing, not just human survival. Creating shelter that doesn't just keep the weather out, but actively contributes to well-being. And the evidence is mounting that this isn't just feel-good philosophy. It's practical reality. Buildings built with these principles work better, cost less to operate, last longer, and make people happier. That's not a romantic notion. That's measured fact. The medieval peasants who built these cabins didn't know they were ahead of their time. They thought they were just doing what needed to be done. But in doing what needed to be done, in solving the problem of shelter, with the materials and knowledge available to them, they created something we're still trying to fully understand and replicate. They built not just houses, but homes. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. Not just survival, but the possibility of flourishing. And they did it without fossil fuels, without electricity, without any of the things we consider essential. Just wood and stone and understanding. Just patience and observation and the accumulated wisdom of generations. That's the legacy. That's what speaks across the centuries. Not instructions or techniques, though those matter too, but the deeper lesson that truly good design serves human life in all its dimensions. Physical comfort, yes, but also social connection, cultural richness, mental peace, the space to be fully human even when the world outside is hostile. The cabin kept them warm, but it did so much more than that. It kept them together. It kept them sane. It kept them capable of being more than just survivors. It let them be people, artists, storytellers, dreamers, communities. And that perhaps is the greatest achievement of all. We should start making our way back now. Back from that winter cabin in medieval Scandinavia. Back across the centuries. Back to the present, to the world of electric lights and forced air furnaces and building codes and all the complexity of modern life. But we're not returning empty-handed. We're bringing back knowledge, understanding, maybe even inspiration. Here's what's happening right now in certain forests of modern Europe, in parts of Austria, in the mountains of Switzerland, in regions of southern Germany, where the old traditions never completely died. People are starting to listen again to those ancient whispers. Architects and builders are combining traditional wisdom with contemporary capabilities. And they're discovering that you don't have to choose between old and new. You can have both. There's a building technique called Brettstapel, sometimes called dowel laminated timber. It's essentially a modern version of solid wood construction. Instead of stacking round logs, you stack dimensional lumber edge to edge fastened with wooden dowels. The result is a solid wood wall similar in principle to the medieval cabin walls, but manufacturable in a factory precise to the millimeter quality controlled. These walls have all the thermal mass benefits of the old log construction. They're heavy, they store heat, but they're also uniform, predictable, able to meet modern building codes without special exceptions. You're getting medieval thermal performance with modern precision. And people are actually building with this. Not just experimental projects or showcase buildings, but real homes for real families. A teacher in Bavaria, a doctor in Vorarlberg, young couples building their first house. They're choosing this approach not out of nostalgia, but because it works. Because it's efficient, because it's healthy, because in a world of rising energy costs and climate uncertainty, it makes sense. Near Innsbruck, researchers documented a remarkable house, 3 stories built entirely from solid timber. In the heart of the Alps, where winter is unforgiving, the family inside pays only a fraction of the heating costs of comparable homes. But numbers tell only part of the story. What they speak about most is how the house feels. The temperature stays steady without constant adjustment. The air feels cleaner. Sleep comes easier than it ever did in their previous conventional home. These are subjective experiences, yes, but when the same stories repeat across different buildings and different families, they point to something real. The house is doing what a house should do. It shelters, it supports, it works quietly in the background instead of demanding constant management. Of course, not everyone can build a new timber house in the Alps. Most of us live in homes that already exist. We can't tear everything down and start over, but the principles still apply. You can borrow the wisdom without rebuilding from scratch. Take thermal mass. You can add it gradually. Stone or tile floors in sunlit rooms can store warmth during the day and release it at night. A masonry or brick feature wall can absorb heat and give it back slowly. New materials, even phase change compounds, can do the same thing, storing heat invisibly within walls and ceilings. Airtightness is even simpler. Seal the gaps. Weather strip doors and windows. Caulk the cracks you never see but always pay for. A blower door test can reveal exactly where your house is leaking heat, and many utilities will help cover the cost because efficiency benefits everyone. Then there's how we heat. Radiant warmth instead of blasting hot air. Heating the rooms you actually use instead of forcing the entire house to one constant temperature. In Japan, there's a concept called setsuden. Different rooms, different temperatures, comfort where it matters. A cool bedroom with warm blankets. A warm living space when you're present. It's not deprivation, it's precision. Perhaps the most powerful step costs nothing at all. Pay attention to your house. Notice where drafts appear. Which rooms stay warm longest? how sunlight moves through your space. That medieval builder learned these things by living inside what he made. We've lost that relationship. We set the thermostat and stop listening. But your house is still speaking. That cold corner is telling you something. That comfortable room is teaching you something. If you listen, you'll start to see opportunities, small changes that add up. And if you are building new or renovating deeply, you can go further. Mass timber, passive solar design, thermal mass, airtight construction, even masonry heaters. These ideas are no longer fringe. They sit at the core of modern standards like passive house ancient wisdom refined with modern precision. This isn't about going backward. It's about remembering what we forgot. Because the truth is uncomfortable, our current housing model only works when energy is cheap and systems never fail. And both assumptions are cracking. Weather is harsher. Grids are fragile. Comfort on demand is no longer guaranteed. What we need now are houses that endure. Houses that stay livable when the power goes out. Houses that work with physics, not against it. Because resilience, real resilience, comes from understanding heat, mass, air, and shelter at their most fundamental level. That's the lesson the old cabins still whisper to us, if we're willing to listen. Medieval times didn't have a choice. They had to build resilient structures, or people died. We've had the luxury of not worrying about it for a few generations. But that luxury period might be ending. And if it is, we're going to need to remember how to build for real, how to create shelter that actually shelters, that works even when everything else fails. That's not pessimism. That's just prudence. That's just recognizing that the future might look more like the past in some ways than we've been comfortable admitting. And if that's true, then this knowledge, this understanding of how to create thermal comfort without massive energy inputs becomes essential, becomes survival knowledge all over again, like it was for those Scandinavian families living through months of darkness and cold. But here's the hopeful part: we can do this better than they did. We have better tools, better understanding of material science, better manufacturing capabilities. We can achieve what they achieved, but with more precision, more predictability, more options. We can build houses with the thermal mass of medieval cabins, but with modern convenience. With running water and electricity and all the things that make modern life comfortable. We don't have to give up indoor plumbing to get good thermal performance. We don't have to choose between comfort and resilience. We can have both. That's what those builders in Austria are proving. That's what the mass timber movement is demonstrating. You can build modern and you can build smart. You can have the efficiency of traditional wisdom and the convenience of contemporary life. The path forward exists. It's being walked right now by architects and builders and families who've decided that the old assumptions don't serve them anymore, who've decided to learn from the past while building for the future, who understand that the best technology isn't always the newest technology, but the technology that works with human needs and physical reality instead of against them. As we prepare to leave that cabin now, as we step back across time to our own moment, we're carrying this understanding with us. We've seen what's possible. We've felt what real shelter feels like. We've understood, perhaps for the first time, that housing can be so much more than we've settled for. The cabin still stands there in our imagination, still warm, still solid, still doing its patient work of sheltering and supporting. And it's offering us a challenge to build that well again, to create spaces that work that faithfully, to recover the wisdom that creates resilience and comfort without requiring constant energy input and constant anxiety about system failure. We can do this. We have the knowledge now. We have the science to explain what medieval times knew by feel. We have the tools to build what they built, but better. All we need is the will to try, the courage to build differently, the wisdom to learn from those who came before us. The cabin is both history and possibility, both memorial and blueprint, both what was and what could be. Again, if we're smart enough to listen, brave enough to try, patient enough to do it right. The fire has long since gone cold in our imagined cabin. The family has gone to sleep hours ago. Outside, the stars are beginning to fade as the first hint of dawn approaches. But the walls are still warm. Even now, even in the deepest cold before morning, those massive log walls are still releasing the heat they stored yesterday, still doing their patient work, still keeping the space livable while everyone sleeps unaware, trusting completely in the shelter that holds them. This is what I hope you take with you as you drift towards sleep tonight. Not just facts about medieval construction or principles of thermal physics, though those matter, but something deeper. The understanding that people before us, people without our technology or our wealth, solved fundamental problems of shelter in ways that we're still trying to match. They weren't superhuman. They weren't magical. They were just careful observers who couldn't afford to get it wrong, who refined their methods across generations until they achieved something remarkable. Buildings that worked with nature instead of against it, that supported human life instead of demanding constant attention that lasted centuries. Because they were built on understanding rather than convenience. And we can learn from that. We can apply that, not by going backward, not by pretending we're medieval peasants, but by recognizing that some principles are timeless. That thermal mass and air tightness and radiant heat storage aren't historical curiosities. They're physical realities that work whether you understand them or not, whether you acknowledge them or not. The people who built those cabins didn't survive winter through strength or stoicism or grim determination alone. They survived because they built houses that did half the work for them. Houses that remembered warmth and gave it back. Houses that stood as partners in survival rather than just passive containers for human activity. That's what shelter can be. That's what it should be. A working relationship between human need and physical reality, mediated by understanding and expressed in wood and stone. As you close your eyes tonight, as you settle into whatever warmth surrounds you, maybe think about that for a moment. Think about the structure that holds you, whether it's working with you or whether you're working against it, whether it's a partner or a burden, whether it shelters you or just keeps the rain off while you struggle to stay warm. And maybe in some small way, you'll be inspired to change something, to seal a draft, to add a stone accent wall in a sunny spot, to turn your thermostat down 2 degrees and discover you're still comfortable because you're wearing a sweater and sitting near a window where winter sun is streaming in. Small changes that connect you back to the logic of thermal comfort, to the understanding that medieval times had in their bones. The cabin in the mountains is still there, in a sense. Not the physical structure, perhaps. Those specific logs have probably long since returned to the earth. But the principle is still there. The wisdom is still there, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be applied again by people who've learned sometimes the hard way that modern methods don't always serve us as well as we'd hoped. Those log walls held families safe through centuries of winter. They can teach us still. They can remind us what shelter really means, what resilience looks like, what it feels like to be truly held by a structure that understands its job and does it faithfully night after night, without complaint, without requiring constant attention, just performing its quiet service of storage and release, of taking the warmth of day and stretching it through the cold of night. Sleep well tonight wherever you are. Whatever structure surrounds you, whatever warmth you have, be grateful for it. Recognize it as precious. And maybe dream of walls that remember of stones, that hold heat like promises of shelter, that does more than just exist, but actively cares actively, works actively, partners with human life to make winter not just survivable, but livable. The medieval peasants who built those cabins left us more than just history. They left us a standard, a question, a challenge. Can we build that well? Can we create shelter that resilient? Can we recover what they knew and combine it with what we know to create something even better? I think we can. I think we must. Because the future asks it of us. Because our children deserve houses that work when systems fail. Because there's something deeply right about creating buildings that support human flourishing, rather than requiring constant energy input just to remain habitable. The cabin taught us this tonight. Across the centuries, across the darkness, across the cold, it showed us what's possible when understanding meets necessity, when patience meets observation, when human need meets physical reality and finds harmony instead of constant struggle. May you carry that understanding into your dreams. May it warm you as those log walls warmed countless families through countless winters. And may you wake tomorrow with new eyes for the shelter that surrounds you, new appreciation for what works, and new understanding of what could work better. The winter night is deep now. The stars are bright and cold. But somewhere in memory or in imagination, or in the eternal pattern of human wisdom, that cabin stands warm and solid. The family sleeps safe within. The walls do their patient work. And the cold, for all its power, for all its hunger, cannot break through. That's the promise of true shelter. That's the gift of real understanding. That's what medieval times built, and what we're learning to build again. Sleep well, dream of warm walls and patient stones, and wake tomorrow ready to build better, to shelter truly, to remember what was lost and make it new again. The cabin's lesson is simple: build with wisdom, build with care, and what you create will shelter not just for a season, but for generations. Not just bodies, but spirits. Not just from cold, but toward warmth, toward comfort, toward the possibility of flourishing, even when the world outside grows dark and cold. That's the story I wanted to tell you tonight. That's the journey I wanted us to take together, from modern fragility back to medieval wisdom, then forward again to possibility. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me through this long winter night of words and ideas and imagined shelters. I hope you found something here worth carrying forward, something that will warm you in winters to come. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and remember, the walls can remember if we build them right. Good night.